Welcome to this next video of Unravelling. If you've been watching the series so far, you'll notice that this is a bit of a different video to the ones that have gone before it. I'm here with Elaine Storkey, who I'll introduce properly in a moment. But this is the third of our videos exploring the issues of sex and gender. So in the first one, we had a look at the debate going on in our culture at the moment, the new approaches to gender that have emerged and some of the critical pushback that's come. And then in the last video, we really explored a Christian worldview on gender and tried to look at what special revelation, what the Bible and Christian tradition has to say about our sex and gender. And this video is really where we're going to step into the questions of, well, how then do we live? Given where our culture's at and given what a Christian worldview has to say, how do we actually walk out in practice, live, embody, and deal with the really pertinent personal issues that all of this brings to the surface? Unfortunately, we've been able to get some help to navigate these waters in the form of Elaine Storkey. Elaine, you've been thinking, writing about these issues, lecturing about these issues for decades now.
That would be true.
So where did it start for you? Where did you first start making forays into this kind of area?
I think it was when I was a young mother. I was an academic and spent nearly all my adolescent years at university, then did further degrees and so on. And I married an academic. And so we were kind of enshrined in this academic haze. And then I had a child. And I think at that stage, lots of questions started to emerge, like how do women academics kind of cash into normal women's lives? Yeah. And I started to study what women were doing, and I chose to stay home with my children, just because they were wonderful. There's nothing more exciting than little people, and why would one want to be anywhere else if you had tiny little things like this around you? So it was then to asking fellow women, or sister women, what do you do all day? Because I didn't know what their lives were like. I mean, it sounds ridiculous. And they would say, well, we do the housework. What does your house look like, And I said, but I've done all the housework. And they said, it's only 10 o'clock in the morning, you can't have done. And it gave me an insight into non-academic life, which I'd forgotten about because it was years since I was home with my mother. And I then began in seriousness to look at women's lives, studying them and getting involved in them, and eventually working with the Open University because it was the most convenient university when my children were small, writing a book, What's Right with Feminism. That was a commissioned book by the editor of Third Way. And it was really looking at the whole issue of gender with women who were feminists. Yeah. So there were women, I was working with a bunch of feminists, very strong feminists, of the kind of third wave, real name feminists in the 1980s when I wrote this book. In the Open University, we would have summer schools, and I would run summer schools on feminist thinking and so on. And it was a hive, really. It was a big time of looking at the ideas about gender that were changing rapidly. Yeah. Because it was in the 1980s that we then separated sex and gender. That's when it happened, for very good reasons. I think that we often forget that now, because in those days, what was sex? Sex was the normality. Sex was the norm, and the norm was male. So everything was seen through male eyes. In fact, most of academia, women's psychology was seen through male eyes. Yeah. Even childbirth, the great authority on childbirth was a man. And so that mold had to be broken, and women scholars were breaking it. They were breaking it in psychology, in the sciences, in sociology, in literature and so on. And it was a real heyday of interest and exploration in these areas.
An exciting time by the sounds of it.
It was. And it was breaking away from the stereotypes. And so sex was that which was biologically given. It constituted our anatomy, our physiology, our chromosomes and so on. And gender is what we made of that in response to culture. The two were never completely separated in the sense that they were always linked together.
Yeah.
But gender was much more culturally orientated. And this was seen to women's advantage because, for example, in some cultures, to be feminine, for example, in African cultures, was to carry heavy loads on your head or your back and the children at the same time. To be masculine was to be walking alongside with a bicycle and chatting away, not carrying heavy weights. And so the differences in culture as to what was feminine and masculine were so marked you couldn't ignore them. And those things were very important to put down, because biology did not dictate women's roles. And this is what we were trying to change.
Yeah.
Biology did not dictate that women had to do the housework and men went out to work. Women could work as well.
Yeah.
And they could do the things that they were adaptive for. I mean, things that they had preferences for and skilled at and so on. And there was no limit to those things that they were skilled at. So it's getting away from stereotypes of femininity and masculinity and looking at the great cultural variation. It was not about transgender.
No.
And we weren't deconstructing sex at that time.
Yeah.
We were simply separating that said that because you were a man, this did not entitle you to have all of these attitudes towards women and to see women in a certain way. And if you were a woman, it did not mean that to be normal was to be natural.
Yeah.
Which was then transcribed as being a housewife and cut off from a lot of the things that made you a woman, and it was interesting for women.
So has it surprised you, Elaine, given that makes sense in that context of what's going on, but now the same sort of language is cropping up? You were thinking about this 30, 40 years ago. For many of us, issues around gender, sex, how we relate the two have only really come to the fore in the last 4 or 5 years with the transgender debate. Has it surprised you that we're now here and that the separation of sex and gender is being played out in this context?
Well, yes and no is the answer to that. I mean, there were people, there were women scholars in the 1980s, 70s and 80s who were pushing the boat too far. So you have people like Shulamith Firestone, and the slogan around was sex is destiny.
Yeah.
So she said, okay, let's change destiny. And how can we change destiny? We have to change sex. And so she was one of the forerunners of saying, wouldn't it be a great idea if we adapted the male bowel so they could have an embryo transplanted and have a baby and bring it to full term? And there was not a queue of men trying to have this
I can imagine.
exploration and surgery. And most of us laughed at it. We just thought, oh, please, this is science fiction. Of course, it's not science fiction anymore. All kinds of things can happen to male bowels or to male bodies and female bodies. But she was a one-off. This was not where most women were, most feminists were. They were far more bothered about allowing women to be authentic women and to honour our bodies and our differences and so on, not to annihilate the body or not to say that sex itself had to be deconstructed. Gender certainly needed to be deconstructed, but not sex.
Yeah.
And so the link was always there. Yeah. So in that sense, I'm amused as well as surprised that it has come a full circle like this. And now we can see the kind of dream that Shulamith Firestone had is actually a bit of a nightmare in many ways, because what she posited as a good idea is now rampantly out of control, and we're needing to rein it in. And I think that's where feminists are now. And of course, feminists have always honoured women's bodies and ignored men's bodies by and large, because it's not our business. Except when they trespass on women's bodies, then it's our business.
And we actually saw in the last video we did, the second video in this, how a lot of the critical pushback has come from feminists writing this area. And given that context you've given us, that's actually not a surprise that they would be some of the first to respond.
And that's partly because of the change in the take-up of transitioning and the take-up of the trans issue. Whereas before, for many, many decades, if not a century, it was a fairly predictable pattern of men who wanted to be women. And we can understand men wanting to be women, we're great. That was the attitude from feminists. But the moment it changed and young girls, younger and younger girls wanted to be boys, then there was a very big question mark. And as you know, over the last decade, it's just been epidemic.
Yeah.
And I think they're very, very worried. They're worried that these young women are not being allowed to be who they really are. They're worried that they're reacting to something very negative in the culture that has put them in a place that they don't want to be in, and the way out is to actually change sex or change gender. And become trans. And they're also worried that they're frightened of their own identity. If it's a lesbian identity, they've been told that this is dirty and nasty and they shouldn't have it, and so they want to get away from that. So those three kind of combined fears have made radical feminists very, very distressed and upset at the proceedings that we have now at the transgender, and the fact that there are so many people on the bandwagon and people making money out of it. And that's always been an issue for feminists, especially the Marxist feminists, the left-leaning feminists. When you get the pharmaceutical company and people doing research and putting money into it and plugging it and distributing these medics, then that really is a big issue, because how are you going to compete with that? It's a big issue. Because they've got the money, they can push it, they can have the media on their side and all the rest of it. And they've done a phenomenal job in doing that. And so I think I'm with the feminists on this and their concern and their anxiety. I'm probably less with them on the stridency and the aggression that sometimes they have towards the issue. Yeah. But I think they've got very, very good reasons for the position they hold.
For the concerns that they have. And Elaine, you can speak not only from your academic background, like you say, kind of theology, philosophy, sociology, or your academic life that has fed into this, but you're also a Christian.
Yes.
And have been serving the church for many decades as well, in different ways, providing some leadership and engage with this. And we'd really like to ask you kind of to speak from that perspective as well. Many Christians now are, perhaps, it's like, again, for 30 years ago, you were working through these issues as a Christian. The rest of us are kind of catching up now, saying, we're disorientated. And most often, the most pressing questions really come to us on the level of kind of people, real individual people. I think we're aware of the sort of movements out there and activists and pressure, but often it really comes to the rub when there's someone in front of you.
Oh, completely. And when it's a member of your own family, that really is where the rubber hits the road. And then suddenly our son tells us, actually, I want to be a girl. I really feel as if I'm a girl. I'm just trapped in this body that I don't want to be trapped in. Or a girl comes along and says, I'm a boy. And then, in a sense, it's not that scales fall from our eyes, but we just see everything in a different kind of way. We realise, wow, this is deep stuff, because it's now hit us, it's the home. And I think the persons do make the difference, and it's a painful transition of understanding and outlook. And I think for Christian parents, it's agony, because the first question they ask themselves is, where did we go wrong? And that's such a sad question, because very often they didn't go wrong anywhere at all. It's just the culture is too big. The culture is too big for us, and it's pushing us in a certain direction. And we need all the prayer, all the Bible understanding, all the kind of energy, spiritual energy we've got to actually come to terms with that culture and to find out what God is saying to us in our relationship with the culture. And that takes a lot of prayer. I know. I've been doing it, I should say, for actually 40 years or longer. And it's you often get it wrong. You can see things coming. You can predict things coming, as we have done in our academic sociology group. But you can't do anything to stop it. And that's the difficulty. Yeah. Except more and more prayer.
So as we saw in one of our earlier videos, there's only a very small number of those who identify as transgender who genuinely suffer with gender dysphoria. We looked at some of those prevalence differences. So, but there is the culture, but of course it can be something that's happened in a child with gender dysphoria as well, as rare as that is. And I guess whether it's out of gender dysphoria or whether it's not that, but there's still a sort of exploration of trans identity for, I think, a question a lot of parents would then ask if they're Christian parents, and probably a lot of us in churches are wrestling with can you be Christian, following Jesus, following his way, and identify as transgender? there's not going to be a pat answer for that. But I think that's a question that we'll all be wrestling with. And certainly, if my child started exploring that, it would be in my mind, I think.
Yeah, I think the answer is very clear that you can.
Yeah.
And I think the moment we suggest that you can't, that somehow or another, your understanding of yourself is so big and so massive that God can't deal with it, and God can't carry on allowing you into his worship and his love. I mean, that's close to blasphemy, actually.
Yeah.
So, of course, a person can be trans and be a Christian. As many of us make mistakes in our life and make wrong choices and a whole range of things, but we're still Christians.
Yeah.
And I think that's the first thing. Because it's a question of who does God love and who does God call into service. And God loves those who love him and call them into service. And then the second question is, how then shall we live?
Yeah.
And the how then shall we live, we can screw it up. We get it wrong. We make wrong decisions. We have wrong perceptions. And God carries on loving us. And I think, and I do believe that many people do have wrong perceptions in terms of understanding their identity. And it's not just trans identity, it's many different forms of identity. And God sorts us out bit by bit, or sometimes we don't get sorted out. But let's never suggest that there are some things that we can't, that God cannot love us and cannot actually affirm us as his followers if we have certain views or attitudes to life. I think that's very important that we get that right. So I think in terms of how a parent deals with their trans child, it's crucial.
Yeah.
And in my experience, I think a lot of it is about talking to parents. It's how you then discuss it. And I think one of the things to do is to come up with some agreement. So what do you want me to call you? Admitting that I'm going to find this really, really hard. You realise that. I'm going to find this so hard, but what do you want me to call you? How are we going to do this? And if I lapse and misgender you, are you going to forgive me for that? Because that's going to happen as well. And at some stage or another saying, I find it difficult to cope with this. This is not who I think you are, not who I believe you to be, but I want to walk with you on this path at the moment and see where it leads us. Praying all the time that whatever issue that the child has that might be holding them back from God will actually be clarified and sorted and sent forward. So I think parenting is a difficult job anyway, but parenting a trans child is particularly difficult, or a child who is now presenting as trans.
Can I change the frame of reference and ask basically the same question again a little bit, but I want to try and draw something out that, so we changed it maybe to, rather than parents and child, say it's someone in your church and you're maybe their pastor.
Yeah.
And they are transgender and they're a Christian, they've come to faith, or maybe they've just grown up in the church and then come into a trans identity, this sort of thing. Now, I expect you'll say the same, you start with a conversation. But I think, are you saying that you're still retaining your own worldview and set of beliefs about what might be God's created intent, and yet you're also prepared to call them what they want to be called, and to, I guess, with that frame of reference, how do we hold all of that? And am I right? Is that what you're trying to...
I think it's very important for pastors to be clued in on this. I mean, first of all, pastors say, there were some things I'd like to share with you, some of my own feelings about this and my own reading or my own sense. Do you know that over the last decade, it's been almost epidemic in this way? So give them some of the statistics that I've got an explanation why this is suddenly kind of multiplying on the scale in which it is multiplying. And then I've also read that there's a whole range of issues that often attach themselves to the transgender issue, and are there when people are transitioning. I'd like some help on this from you, because these seem to me to be fairly persuasive arguments or fairly persuasive issues that need to be taken into consideration. So in a very gentle way, listen to what the person is saying, and then say, but I really need you to do some reading along this, and I need to read what you're doing, and so that I can better understand it, so that there is some kind of dialogue going on. I think it's very important that pastor doesn't just simply saying, "Oh, that's wonderful! It's so good that you found a really fine identity now, and let's all kind of celebrate it." I mean, I've come to churches where they design a liturgy for people transitioning, because now this is God's will, let's all celebrate it. And you'll see the person who is transitioning, and you think, are you sure about this? Because this person is full of kind of spiritual issues that they're struggling with in their own lives. And suddenly a change of gender seems to be the way through those spiritual issues. But of course it's not. And 5 years down the line, they might feel that they made the wrong decision there. They might not, but they might do. So I think the churches that jump on the bandwagons, have a big celebration and incorporate it into their whole way of life, need to stop first and think about, what are we doing? What are we doing here? Are we that sure that this person is following the trajectory that God has laid out for us? And I think caution, at the very least caution, is very, very important, because a wrong response here might affirm somebody in a direction that they will regret enormously later. And, when it comes to issues of detransitioning, people are often in a quagmire over that one too.
Are you, Elaine, how have you found it for yourself as you've spoken with people who have trans identities, and you maybe served with them, you've been like, have you, believing what you believe, holding the Christian worldview you hold, how have you found the way they've received you? How have these conversations, have you found it possible to do this?
It's hard, and it's hard particularly for me when somebody who transitions to a woman and wants to be embraced by me as a sister feminist, and feels that I will be really on her side, and will want to affirm everything that she now thinks and believes and so on, and that is hard, because I want to love this person, and I do love this person. I'm thinking specific people now. I admire them in many ways. They've got qualities that I wish I had myself, and there's all kinds of things about them. Most of them are Christians. They're wonderful. But and that's fine, so we can walk together. They know that if it came to a vote in the Church of England on some of these issues, I would not be on the same side as they are. They know that, but we can still get on together. Where for me the rubber hits the road is when they ask a very personal question. Do you experience me as a woman? I find that so hard, because usually I don't, you see. And with the best will in the world, I don't. And so do I say, no, I experience you as a man? Well, I don't experience him as a man either. But I simply say, that's a hard question for me to answer, because I don't experience you as a woman, but I don't know how to say this without hurting you, without causing you pain. And for me, that's usually when they want to break relationship off with me. And I think that's unfair, because I'm quite happy for them to affirm what they are saying about themselves as what they're saying, but it cannot be demanded of me and my experiences, because those are different. So there are all kinds of things to navigate and negotiate when you're relating with people who are openly trans and wanting affirmation and love and so on. But in the end, love isn't that difficult, because we're all bigger than our identity, our sexual identity, our gender identity, or whatever. And whether having to give yourself a label is always diminishing the self in some way or another.
That's really important and helpful. I think that, somebody once said to me, as we were talking about, what do you do as a pastor? And we said, well, it's clearly not the first conversation you have, because this is a whole person. And with other people, we wouldn't immediately jump on some small thing. And remembering it as just one part of the whole big picture of a wonderful, unique individual. So, Elaine, it sounds like from what you've said that you would, you have your own views and your own experience. And as you just said, that's sometimes where the boundary is, if something's
Yeah.
required of you. But it sounds like you would lean quite heavily towards being as accommodating as possible of that person's, what they want to be called, their
Yes.
pronouns,
Yes.
the way they want to be. Is that
That's
fair?
a part of respecting them, that's all.
Okay.
And actually, the more you respect, the more they will share with you,
Yeah.
and the more questions you can ask, and the more you learn yourself. So I have a friend who was a girl at birth, and is now a man, and a lovely man, a
Yeah.
really delightful man. And we've got to know each other well enough that I can ask a series of, and have asked a series of questions as to when the decision to transition took place, what kind of transitioning has happened,
Yeah.
whether there's it's drugs or therapy or surgery or whatever. We've talked about everything related to bodies. I've listened very carefully. This person, he's not found it insulting that I'm probing or prying. The moment somebody does find it insulting, then you must stop.
Yes.
But we've had drinks together, shared everything, looked at his experiences when he was a girl, and he's been very clear. He was autistic as a child. He had problems with his relationship with his mother, and she had lesbian relationships, and that was profoundly disturbing for him. And so we've gone through the trajectory, and I understand why he's transitioned, and want to affirm him. And then for me, the last and most significant question came after a couple of years of relationship with this man, where I said, and so will you go eventually for full surgery?
Yeah.
And he said no. And I said, so there's something in you that's still holding you back. And he said, I never know if I will want to transition again.
Yeah.
I will never know. At the moment, I am who I am. And so that leaves it open, and it leaves the relationship open. He's in no doubt as to what I feel about the issue of transitioning, and he knows that himself. He knows the figures.
Yeah.
He's read the stuff. He's done the homework, and I think out of respect, I want to journey there too. But it doesn't stop, in any sense, my sense of living in a binary universe. And I think that the binary is the norm. And we won't change that binary norm by our language. The moment we insist that we have this inclusive language that everybody must affirm, so I have to be cisgender, because that means that I am comfortable with the gender that was assigned me at birth, and I refuse to be cisgender on the grounds that I was not assigned a gender at birth. I was born female, and I'm a woman now. And so I'm not going to use the language, because the moment we use the language, then we're normalising a situation which is still questionable, and still needs to be examined properly.
That's really helpful. I think it raises for me the question of how I might want to love someone and how they might receive that, and there being some disconnect there that for some people at least, and certainly in our culture, to be loved also means to be agreed with.
Yes.
If you don't agree with me, then you're not accepting me,
Yeah.
you can't love me. And even if I really do love and want to love this person, but sometimes there can be that barrier. And, if you experience that sort of, if you don't agree with me, then however much you say you love me, it's sort of patronising really, or it's not genuine. And how have you made your peace with that reality, that's what many might say,
Well, I think that with two people, I've simply said, why does your relationship with me depend on me agreement from me? Oh, this person once, we'd had a long discussion, and we come to a conclusion. We're on a committee together, and this person's conclusion wasn't the same as mine, and I voted in a different way from this person. And this person was very, very upset and said, you just haven't listened to me. And I said, yeah, I have. I've sat here and I've listened to you till my ears are falling off. I just don't agree with you. And you'll have to accept that. I've listened to you. I love you. I have enormous respect for you, and I disagree with you. All of those come together. Can we not still walk in relationship? This person found that very, very difficult, that somehow or another I had to be in agreement. And then I asked the question, so why do I have to be in agreement before you can have a relationship with me that you recognize as a relationship of love? Because I don't feel that way at all, you see. I can carry on loving you and disagree. Why can't you do the same? And in fairness, this person then said, okay, I'll go away and think about that and let you know the answer.
Yeah.
But it was a weight lifted off both our shoulders, you know, because this person then realized that I actually did love this person and was in receipt of that love. And the disagreement was possible, even in a loving relationship. And of course it's possible.
Probably, I guess that person might eventually have accepted that because they had had years of you actually loving them. But that can be where we can go wrong, I think, isn't it? That we somehow feel we have to get everything sorted in the first few months of knowing someone, but they haven't then really known our love.
That's right.
To have the stability to carry the harder conversations, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there have been other people that I disagree with. One in particular where I once went in a moment of quite a lot of trauma in my own life related to a work situation, and I had to make a big decision really by 3 o'clock that afternoon. There was no one around that I could talk to or pray with, and I spotted this friend, and a friend I would normally never have asked to or confided in, and I felt God saying, okay, share it with them. So I went to this person and shared this and asked would they pray with me. And they were so overcome with the request to pray. We prayed, and for me the issue was clarified in that prayer. Now that was somebody who had profound disagreements with me on so many issues, theological, gender, sexual, everything. And yet our humanness and the fact that we both believed in a God to whom we could speak and ask for guidance, that actually overrode everything else in that relationship. And we've been very good friends ever since that time. And he's publicly stated this, that here is Elaine, I'd like you to listen to her. You will not agree with her, but she's worth listening to. And you know, this is wonderful. And
so once again, you were able to zoom out of the particular issues you disagreed on to a bigger picture.
Yes.
That made relationship possible.
Yeah, and to one where God is at the centre, because it was about God, not about me or her or them. It was actually about trying to find God's will in a situation.
So, Elaine, one of the things we talked about in part 1 of Unravelling was that if we're living in a world without God, if our worldview's ultimately on those foundations, that whereas we might speak about disagreeing but still being able to love across that and having a bigger picture, but if you're in a world without God, some of these issues are so close to our identity and might be or feel like all we have. It's not just a disagreement. It can feel like an all or nothing or a hill to die on. It can feel very, very important. And therefore, I guess, whereas we might see it as disagreement, it might be experienced far more threateningly than that, as a denial of who we are, our existence even. I'm sure some of the slogans might come to mind that particularly the activists might use, this kind of thing. So I guess, what is there anything how do we respond to that we might be perceived as very threatening and potentially even abusive, or because we disagree?
Yes, and I've experienced this too. One person in a debate where I had stood up and spoken fairly explicitly, I thought quite gently, also stood up and said, if I were to take what you have just said seriously, I would want to, I might even be led to commit suicide. And I said, sorry, I'm not accepting that from you. That's not the case, and that's not what I have said. That's not the spirit of what I have said. I went away afterwards and thought about that, and then contacted this person and said, I think we need to talk about this, because I don't know why you said that in the debate. I felt you were just posturing, but now I think that maybe you weren't, so can we talk about it? We did talk about it, and she admitted that she was. posturing. She wanted to make the point as forcefully as she could, because she said in that situation she felt totally powerless, and I had removed any vestige of power away from her, and I represented the threat of the church in that position, over and against someone like her who was just wanting to live a normal life for her. And I apologised and said if that's what I did, then I had no right to do that, and I'm sorry. I didn't realise I was doing that. Can we talk more about it? And in talking about it, I think that I didn't change my position at all. She didn't change her position at all. But there was a new meeting together where she knew I did not want A, her to commit suicide, and B, to be a threat, nor did I want the church to be a threat to these people. And then asked, how can you advise me? How can I help you? And how can you help me to be more help, to be in a place where you can trust me and not see me as a threat, because I don't want to be a threat to you. And then she said to give up some of your power. And I asked what that power was, and she said, in your case, it's the power of intellect, it's the power of being a persuasive speaker and so on. And I said, I cannot give that up. That's who I am. Yeah. That's my identity. So here now we have to find a place where I can be myself and you can be yourself, and we can meet together and both enjoy who we are without experiencing the threat in the relationship. We're still working on that. We have not got to a place where I would feel that we've resolved it, but we're still in relationship, and that's the important thing. The other thing that you have to say is these things take time, a tremendous amount of time, take effort, take energy, and sometimes they're agonizing. And I think we have to think about what it is to be a threat to other people because of our views and because of the articulation of our views. And the church doesn't feel it's a threat. It feels it's loving and outgoing and warm and fuzzy, and drawing people in. And very often it doesn't feel like that to the other people. Yeah. It feels it's forbidding, authoritarian, sometimes quite vicious, judgmental, and so on. Yeah. And we have to work on that, because that's not who Jesus was. Yeah. And that's not how Jesus dealt with things. And I think that being able to be more Christ-like in the church, whilst holding on to the firmness of God's revelation to us and the integrity of the creation that we live in, it's a massive task, but that's what we're here for.
Yeah. It feels intimidating, you sort of putting it like that, a real, but necessary. And I wonder if you, either from conversations you've had in the past or your own experience, or how might a local church seek to, if we want to be the kind of people and do the sorts of things that could help trans people who struggle with their gender identity, people who disagree with us, to still feel not threatened, to feel like they can come and be in relationship with us. So many churches, like the culture, seems polarised, don't they? Like you referenced there, that they either kind of affirm. We talk about affirming and non-affirming churches as a polar. Some of us don't necessarily want to occupy those roles.
Exactly.
So how might we become better places for people who disagree with us to find a home?
Yeah, I think it's helping people to find a voice, their own voice in the church, and voice of exploration. So people on the trans issue, it's okay for people to say, I don't know where I am on this issue. I haven't worked it out yet. I don't know how to get through the quagmire that I see in front of me. And to say that to trans people who are hopefully coming to our church because they feel loved there. Yeah. But it's also important to let them speak, let trans people speak about themselves and who they are and so on. Not with sometimes they're just sharing who they are, and then not just reject them because of all those things. Carry on with the relationship, even though the church itself might have a very different position on it, and explaining to the person that there were two issues here. There were doctrinal issues and pastoral issues. And we mustn't muddle them up. I mean, what we hold doctrinally is actually sacrosanct, but unless that's all communicated in love, we're violating 1 Corinthians 13 for kickoff, you know.
Yeah.
Unless we've got even if we've got the faith that can move mountains, and you know, we can do everything possible in terms of our doctrinal understanding, if we haven't got love, if we don't go out and actually love the other person as they are, then we're failing them. So I think that the pastoral implications are so important. We don't know where that person is spiritually before God. That's the other thing. We don't know what's going on between God and the human heart of another person. We don't know. Yeah. So we just carry on praying and hoping that if God reveals something to us about that in the relationship with them, that we then have the freedom to share that. And we share it in love, you know, and we share it in care, and we never share it in judgment. So, I mean, there are no easy ways through. No. It's a huge issue. But I do know that a lot of trans people have been deeply hurt by those who've just rejected them because they have voiced their own anxiety about their identity and desire to place it somewhere else, and somehow another person can't cope with that, and so that's been the end of the relationship.
So would you say there's actually quite a real discipleship requirement on those who aren't trans in churches? Yeah. So you talk about, you know, giving them a voice, permission to speak, to respectfully listen and receive that, which is a giving of power, isn't it, in some ways?
That's right.
And that can make others in the church feel afraid, intimidated. So there's actually a discipleship requirement for everyone else as well, to have to lay down their lives to grow, to be able to cope with unresolved, uncomfortable situations.
Yes, some Christians feel that unless they're very definite and very firm and very directive in what they believe and letting people know this, then they're letting God down. Yeah. I don't find that myself. I think that obviously we have to be firm in our understanding of the uniqueness of Jesus Christ, of the atonement, of the fact that there's no way to God except through Jesus, and come in enormous humility to God that way, and to be firm about our Christian faith and what God has revealed to us about God's self is part of being a Christian. But then how we treat other people, how we relate to them, is a different part. And that we're relating to them in love and in gentleness and in wisdom, recognizing that very often they're damaged people, struggling people, who would like to be somewhere else in their lives. And they're there not because this is what they've chosen, but they feel they had no alternative. And walking with them through that morass into something that's full of grace, I think that it's a big task. But we're not letting God down by doing that. Yeah. We're actually being more like Jesus. Yeah. You know? When the woman caught in adultery was brought to Jesus, he didn't join the judgmental crowd and say, okay, you know, let her have it because this is the law. He challenged them. You know, which of you is without sin? Who's going to throw the first stone? Yeah. And then when he finally blessed her, he didn't say, okay, well, you're very fortunate you got let off that. He said, go in peace, but sin no more. Yeah. And that's the Jesus thing, go in peace, but sin no more. Now, we don't know what sin is in another person's life, but I think we can accept that message ourselves and continue to pass it out.
So given what we've talked about, Elaine, we're thinking of all of those in our church who might struggle with this issue. And you've talked about how really we want to respect and accommodate as much as possible whilst holding our own worldview with integrity. And I imagine there'll be some people in our churches who will say, well, it's a sin, transgenderism's sinful, and therefore we just need to, you know, that's the way that they might think. And I guess out of our conversation, just wanted to put that question to you. How would you respond to that sort of, it might be fear-based, it might have all of that you've talked about, a nervousness of letting God down, but some will say it's sinful, and then they'll have some therefores after that. And how might you respond to that kind of concern in the church?
I think the moment the church starts proclaiming what is sin, it has to be absolutely sure that it knows what it's talking about.
Yeah.
Because if we make a mistake here, it has enormous repercussions in people's lives.
Yeah.
We know that some things are sin because they're revealed to us in the scriptures. We know that adultery is sinful.
Yeah.
There are lots of things we don't know about. I know what the sins are in my life. No idea what the sins are in your life, but you will know those. So I
Yeah.
think here is where we leave it. We don't start to proclaim that a certain kind of identity that people have assumed for themselves is sinful. If we do, we're negating them at a very, very deep level. We leave that between them and God and actually go on showing the ways in which these things have become kind of important in our society or developed in certain ways and so on. I think we have avoided using the word sin in this context because it will not get across what we're trying to say.
Yeah.
It will just create a barrier between us and the people we're trying to serve.
Yeah, and there's a massive confusion even in that question around what sin is.
Absolutely.
Never mind what
Absolutely.
transgenderism is or
Yeah.
individual people. So
Yeah.
I think that's really helpful. So how might we talk about this well in our church so we can have a conversation now? I have to go back and and have some responsibility of leadership in a local church, and you know, and you're engaged in a church, and you've been involved for many years in church leadership. How do we do this well? How do we lead local churches through these sort of issues well? What's helpful? What's unhelpful?
I think the lead from the pastoral team, the eldership or whoever forms that team is important. And I think the diversity of views in the team, not necessarily in terms of doctrine, but the diversity of views in terms of the skills that they use to help people.
Yeah.
So there will be some people on the team who are better at this than others, and working together in a pastoral way, in a gentle way, knowing who to hand people on to if it's beyond your skill set is really important. I think every church needs a person on the team who is pastorally sensitive at the deepest possible level, so that they're known for that in a church, so people can make a beeline for them, and in a way then the whole of the leadership team can be contained well. If you've got nobody like that in a church, you've got a big problem, because the whole church will feel judgmental and so on. So I think it's handling it sensitively, giving leads from the team that's leading the church, and then encouraging everybody else in the church not to swiftly move to judgment, but to always recognise people are bigger than the labels that they give themselves, whatever those labels are, and recognise them as people created by God with love. God created them in love. Their legacy is love. Their birthright is love, and our mission is love, and all of those have got to come together in our relationships.
I've heard some talk about the importance of hospitality, really, of
wonderful.
really having people in your home, in your life, and all of that coming way, way before any of conversations around their identity or anything else. And I sometimes wonder if as leaders, as well as talk about that, we kind of have to model it. So having spent a bit of time talking really around individuals, where this lands personally, people's lives, and how we walk that out as a churches and all the rest of it, just wanted to ask you a bit, Elaine, about the public square. I guess my first question is, should we, as Christians, aim to have any voice in the public square on issues around sex and gender? And if so, why and what, or should we just keep quiet and manage our own churches as best we can?
Well, if we keep quiet, we've only got ourselves to blame if the whole culture heads off in a disastrous and destructive direction.
Right.
So part of our calling is to give assent, give word to the hope that is in us, to articulate it. And that hope is the hope in Jesus, but it has implications. So helping people to understand salvation comes through Jesus, then posits the question, so what does it look like on the ground?
Yeah.
What does a saved community look like? What does redemption look like in the public square, public arena? And I think there are lots of areas that the church neglects terribly in terms of looking what redemption looks like. You know, we have a massive arms trade, for example.
Yeah.
We're manufacturing weapons of mass destruction all the time. Why aren't we kind of standing up and saying, this is not redemptive living? This is destructive. It's just going to kill millions of people somewhere in the globe. So there are lots of things we're not speaking out on, we never have done. The big problem is that we do speak out an awful lot on sex.
Yeah, yeah.
So we're known as people who get their knickers in a twist about sex, but actually don't give a hang about the bigger issues about poverty or as I've just said, warfare or a load of other things like that. So I think that there's a danger, and that was behind your question, I suspect.
I think so, yeah.
That we've already got a label about sex in terms of we're bigots, we're holding people back. You know, we believe so firmly in no sex before marriage and you know, faithfulness for life, which I hope we do. I mean, I think those are good ways of living, but that somehow people see those as repressive rather than a liberating, which actually they are. To have a liberating sex is a sexual understanding and a sexual ethic that does restrain you from having sex with all and sundry, or even just being led astray by your passions, and by having a faithful partner for the rest of life. It is enormously liberating. But so we have to concentrate on what's liberating about sex and get this message across, which we have failed to do.
Yes.
Now, it's not our fault entirely that we failed to do it. It's the media.
Yeah.
They've made us into bigots. They've proclaimed us in certain kinds of ways. They haven't heard what we have been saying that is profoundly liberating and healthy in terms of our relationships. And that's we've not been given a good press. But we don't make it worse by saying nothing, or else by jumping on bandwagons and affirming everything. I mean, that's no help either.
And that's pointing us forward a little bit to the next part of Unravelling. These issues we're talking about today, particularly around gender and sex, are not unrelated to issues of sex, marriage, etc. And one of the things we explored on our last video, or mentioned really, was that because of the way we've been perceived / the way we've sometimes spoken, those who might want to draw near to God will feel like he wants to stay really distant from their struggles around gender, sex, sexual identity. And we said in the last video that the God that we know actually draws closest to us in the places we're most broken or suffer or and so counterintuitively it's actually in those places we're most likely to meet him often. As much as anything else. But it makes me think about if that is often how we're perceived, as repressive, killjoys, anti-everything, that how do we not get drawn into the sort of culture war we're in at the moment, where even if you take the Christians out of it, you've got a massive fight going on. A lot of our views are shaped by activists that have very loud voices and are in the media, and so it's often said that many transgender people don't feel particularly well represented by the activists who would speak on their behalf. How on earth, as the church, when we enter the public square, do we avoid getting pulled into the polarisation, being, you're in this camp, you're in that camp? You've had to do it for many decades, Elaine. How do you navigate that?
Oh, there is no real answer to that, Tim. Right. I mean, it's prayer, and more prayer. I mean, I'll just give you an example. And because the media have already decided who we are and what we're like. Yeah. I was on one of the channels, Channel 5, I think. There was a discussion about sex and marriage. And I was asked to take part in this discussion, which I did, went along, realised too late when I got there that I was the moralist.
Right.
So they're looking at the composition of the panel. They had the tic-tac man who was going on about women as though they were horses and fillies with their backsides and so on. Terrible language. There was a page 3 girl who had slept with goodness knows how many men in order to get forward in her career in media or whatever it was. It was porn acting, really. And several other people on this panel. There was a man who was about to get married for the third time, and I was the moralist. So we started with this man talking about women in a very derogatory way. Then we had the page 3 girl saying that no, she didn't feel bad about the fact that she slept with all these men and so on, and she had to do that in order to earn a living, and no, she didn't want to be judged by anybody else. And then it came to me. So what do you think of that? I was furious with the man.
Yeah.
I thought, you so-and-so, you just set me up, so I'm now to come out as the Christian moralist with this line. So I said, I just really want to make a point first, and that is that you're very beautiful, I said to this girl. Why would you feel, bad about yourself? You're so beautiful. And then I said to the presenter and the man who was chairing it, and I don't want to be the moralist. I don't want to be the position that you've now forced me into. I want to say something else. And what I want to say is, I'd really like to hear this girl's story and why she ended up sleeping with men and being on page 3. Because just look at her. She's so beautiful. And she must be rich in experience of the whole thing. But I suspect that somewhere in her story, there is a lot of pain and a lot of hurt and a lot of grief. And I really feel that I'd like to hear that. So at the end of the programme, if you don't mind, I'd like to go and have a conversation with you. This girl started crying in the programme, saying she's right. She's right. And then going through a series of abuse that she'd gone through and so on. The producer was furious. He was going like this, cut this. This is not the way we want this programme to be, getting really, really uptight. Then this man who was about to get married said to me, so what do you think about sex and marriage? So I said, not a great deal. I mean, as a matter of fact, I've been married to one man for ages. I've never had sex with anybody else. What is there to think about? We just have a good time together. I love him, he loves me, and we're faithful to each other. Then this man who's getting married said, well, that's the kind of marriage I want to have. I've messed it up twice now. And so we started to have this incredible discussion when I said, but with Jesus, it's all possible, you see. This is the point. We can start from fresh tomorrow, today even, because we have a new start coming. And this man was going, cut this programme. This is not going in the direction I wanted. And they've never asked me back because I didn't fulfill the part that they wanted me to do.
Yeah.
It's very difficult. Now I came away from that angry that I've been set up like that, but relieved and grateful to God that He's actually given me the opportunity not to be like that. And it was prayer. I mean, if I had, none of it was planned, and I think most of my life and most of other people's lives really happen not through planning. Yeah. You're in a situation, you just pray into that situation. Whatever I have to do here, Lord, give me the right to do it. Give me the wisdom, the sense, and the courage, if courage is needed, and steer me on the right track. And forgive me if I make a mess of it. Yeah. And if you go into something like that, you're always out of your depth. Yeah. In the public square, I'm always out of my depth. I think most Christians are. I think most people are, as a matter of fact. I was in a studio once, somebody had been interviewed about something, he was giving the party line, then they switched the mics off and everything, and he turned to me and said, and if you believe that, you'll believe anything. And I said, do you mind being phony on air? Yeah. I said, not a bit. It's what I'm paid to do. Yeah. And so that's what the public square is often like as well. Yeah. But there are real people in the public square listening to us as Christians and wanting to hear what we're saying and wanting to hear some good news. And they don't want to hear layers and layers and layers of bigotry because they've heard that before. They want to hear something fresh and new and rejuvenating. And I think we can do it. We've got a great gospel out there. Yeah. We've got wonderful Christian lives that we can point to. We've got people who have given themselves in sacrifice for other people. We've got lots of things to tell people. So let's do it. And let's not be squeezed and pushed into a corner where we're just saying things that are negative and upsetting everybody.
Yeah. And that's an amazing opportunity that you had there, and a real kind of challenge for us, that we almost have to not fit in the frameworks that we're sometimes given and reject the premises of what we're asked to speak into to try and tell our story, really, to tell our gospel. I guess, Elaine, I'd want to ask you about that's particularly important, I guess, where we personally have a chance to speak, those of us that might be invited to do that. To what extent do you think we should be engaged? I guess I'd call it lobbying, really. Many Christians are concerned about legislation that may or may not be passed. So a big one at the moment that there's been consultations on and all sorts is around conversion therapy. I think almost everyone's agreed that particular things that count as that should be banned, but how wide the definition is one example, or things that schools may or may not have to teach, for church schools in particular. So we get these issues in the realm of law, and I've just sort of said to you, didn't I, some people might send me a petition a week to sign, and others would say, you can't do anything about that. And how important do you think it is that we do lobby and have Christian politically minded organisations, or is that often playing the part we don't want to play?
No, I think it's vital that we do.
Okay.
I mean, it's part of our calling as Christians to be public witness in the public square. We have to make sure we get it right before we start lobbying for something. But by and large, I mean, I don't think Christians are wildly out in these issues.
No.
I think by and large they have got it right. One very important thing, and I think it's quite helpful, is to find out who else shares this view and form alliances and work with them, rather than just soldiering on our own. So, I mean, this happened to us some years ago when I was president of Tear Fund, and I was concerned about the fact that the government hadn't ratified the Istanbul Convention. It's a long story, but the Istanbul Convention, we'd signed it but not ratified it from the Council of Europe, and the convention says that we have to have zero tolerance towards violence against women.
Yeah.
I just spent 20 years of my life writing books about violence against women and researching it, and felt it was very important that our government should do this. So I was mentioning this to a bunch of Christians, and so one of them said, when are you starting your campaign? So I said, I'm not a campaigner, I'm just a speaker, I'm just a researcher. She said, that's wet, Elaine, completely wet. Somebody needs to have a campaign. So I said, look, you can do this, you're a campaigner. All right, I will. Well, within minutes, she got a group of Christians together. 3 weeks later, she phoned me and said, we need more than Christians involved. I'm going to see who else can join us in this, ratifying the Istanbul Convention. Anyway, cut a long story short, she pushed the boat out, got lots and lots of feminist groups, Muslim groups, groups from people of other faiths and so on, school groups, educational groups. And finally, she got a member of the Scottish Parliament, SNP, to put it as a private member's motion. And then she said, pray hard, because this has got to get through 3 readings. Private members' motions don't get through 3 readings. This one did. Yeah. Amazingly, the last one, they tried to talk it out and it still got through. And so technically, it should have been ratified by the British government. It didn't because of COVID and the failure and everything sort of stopping. And then, of course, Parliament changed and Johnson came in and everything altered. But that was a brilliant example of a very, very fine lobby by a dedicated woman who felt this really was God's will to move in this direction. And I think that on the transgender issue, there are lots of people doing the work already. I mean, the radical feminists are doing very good work on it. And I think that rather than just go around criticising them, we can stand in solidarity with them on some of these issues. And they are happy to receive our solidarity. They still think we're weird because we're Christians. Believe in a male God, and we've got to deal with all of that and have dialogues in those areas as well. But I think working with people whose views you share, and similarly in education, there are lots of people really bothered about what's going on in our schools and what's being taught. And they've already done the homework. They've already got things running and moving. And to have Christians in solidarity with those is a good way. So working with people who share, whose vision we share and who share our vision in these small areas, even though we are confessionally very different, we believe different things fundamentally about the meaning of life, but we share things that we have the same vision in this area. I think that's really, really helpful. And it's happened on climate change issues too. There are a lot of interfaith initiatives on climate change. And it happens in the whole area of warfare and peace and so on. I think it's vital that we get politically active. It's really a very important stand as long as it doesn't kind of then overwhelm the rest of our message.
Yeah.
Because the central message is that God is in Christ reconciling the world to God's self. That's the central message. And how is he doing it in this area? What does redemption look like in this area? Well, it looks like actually teaching children sensible things about bodies and sex and relationships, and not things that were going to harm them.
Yeah.
And in terms of conversion therapy, since you mentioned it, you take your lead there from people in the gay community who are actually believe that you've got to be very careful about conversion therapy, but actually define it properly.
Yeah.
As long as you define it properly, and don't include praying with somebody as conversion therapy, because it's not, especially when that person is asked to be prayed for in this respect. But now it's outlawed if you don't, if you define conversion therapy in certain ways, everything is outlawed.
Yeah.
So definitions are very important.
Yeah.
Whatever you're bringing before Parliament in order to change the law, make sure the definitions are right and that you know what's implied by the long haul of that.
And the way you describe that actually invites us into relationship again, doesn't it?
Absolutely,
That
absolutely.
reminds me of Citizens UK, another movement which focuses about partnering with all sorts. But when we do that, we actually are far more in our communities.
Yeah, and I was once asked to speak at a climate change climate conference on ecology. This was in the very early days, and it wasn't a Christian conference; it was a secular conference. And I went along, and a bunch of Christians came with me, and there were a lot of us. And we asked if at the end of the day we could have a small group of us who were doing. Have a homily, prayer and Bible reading for anybody else who might want to come. Well, at the beginning it was just a dozen of us Christians committing the rest of the day to God, thanking him for all that we'd done and so on. The next day it was much, much bigger. By the end you had a swell of people coming, because what they were hearing from the speakers was tuned in together, and they heard a Christian vision for the first time, because that was their passion. They thought, if Christians are involved in this, what are they doing this thing in the evening? We'll join them and see. And I think that you building bridges and walking the same ground together, and it's a part of a mission. You don't do it because it's part of a mission. You do it because it's right to do it. Yeah. But it has missiological implications, and that's really important.
And I'm so glad you said that, to get those things in the right order. Because if you get them in the wrong order, you're really just using people.
That's right.
Aren't you?
Yeah,
and
that's right.
The bottom falls out of it. So.
Yeah.
That's so helpful, Elaine. And just in the public square, I must ask you, how have you coped with the fact that no matter how well you've spoken and how well you may have conducted yourself, and I'm guessing that there will have been people who will have just labelled you as, whether that's homophobic, transphobic, anti this, anti that. You know, you will have had negative briefings given against you.
Even before I speak.
So how do you handle that kind of level of what you would feel as misrepresentation and kind of animosity, and how have you
Well, I first start by asking God to examine my heart, to make sure that they're not right. If they're right, then I've got some work to do. And I think I start there. They could be right. I could be homophobic. I could be sinful in a whole range of areas that I'm unaware of, or I'm gullible and kidding myself. So start there. And then secondly, I think reaching out to other people all the time in a different kind of way, and sure. Another story to give an example. I was asked to give lectures on secularization and community at one of the universities in Northern Ireland. It's Vice Chancellor lectures, and a series of 3 lectures. And then I was phoned up a couple of weeks before to say that there were going to be protests in the street outside before I lectured, because somebody had discovered that I was a patron, they thought, of True Freedom Trust, which is an organisation for counselling people in gay relationships, or people who had same-sex attraction. And they were very unhappy about this, because this was the LGBTQ community who were saying I shouldn't come and I should be no platformed. So he said, what do you want to do about this? It could be quite hostile reconcile. So I said, what do you want me to do about it? So I said, I want you to come. So I'm coming. So then they had dialogue with this group, and the group was persuaded not to demonstrate in the streets and hold up placards and so on, but come to the lectures. So the first lecture...
That must have been intimidating.
There were 40 members of this group in the first few rows. I gave my talk on whatever it was. I can't even remember what the talk was on. Very kind of anodyne talk, nothing really polemic about it at all. The first question was, you spoke a lot about community. What do you think about the gay community?
Yeah.
So I said, okay, so what is the gay community? You know, do they follow the norms of community? This is what communities are. I gave them a list of things that communities are. You know, that they work for the better, for common good, and they look after one another and so on. Listed the whole thing. If the gay community is following these things, it's a community. Yeah. So they all looked bewildered by this response, and then another one and another question, and I answered them all. And then somebody said at the end, so you're really not against us? And I said, I don't understand that question at all. How could I be against you? I don't even know you. You know, we haven't got a relationship. I'd like to have a relationship with you. And I'm really grateful that you've come to listen to the lectures tonight, but don't make assumptions about me. This is who I am. And I also mentioned that I wasn't a patron of True Freedom Trust. I had spoken once at their conference, but they're a very good organisation and they completely misunderstood them. Anyway, the next night, people carried on coming back. And the third night, the people who'd led this group were there in force. The 5 of them were still left when they came to all the lectures, which was lovely. And I loved these people. They were lovely, really lovely young students. I thought, you know, I'd love them to be in any of my classes and so on. And at the end of it, I was to have a late night dinner with the Vice-Chancellor, and I just thought I really need to clear my head and walk up and down the street. And suddenly there was this kind of little bustle. And somebody said, well, there she is. And then these people rushed over, and I recognised 3 of them as people who'd been to the lecture all the way through. And one of the others said, you'll be glad to know we've just elected these 3 as our secretary, chairman, and vice chairman, and treasurer, and they're going to be leading it. So I said, oh, you must be the LGBT community. And yeah, and these are our representatives now. And they all came and hugged me, shook my hands and hugged me. And they said, thank you for the lectures. You did a really good job, and disappeared. And I thought, what was all that about? What was going on there? Yeah. I mean, they heard what I had to say. They knew my position and everything. And they showed me love, public love in the street. And that blew my mind, you know. And I think that's why God wanted me to take that walk, wanted me to have that sense of communication with people with whom I disagreed, and was resolved. So I think it's how do you deal with it? How do you deal with it? You just keep on taking it back to God, and keep on asking God, if I'm in error here, correct me. Don't let me hurt other people. Don't let me spoil people's lives because of the way I present something or because of what I think. Don't let my bigotry, whatever it is, get in the way of their growth and their coming to faith. Just help me to be the kind of person that they want to relate to, and that brings them to faith in Jesus. And if God does that through me, then I'm satisfied. If I screw up, God forgives me. Yeah. So either way, we're okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much. There's one last question I want to ask you, and it's to bring it back to where you started. You started by telling us that it was when you became a mother that you first started really wrestling with issues which ultimately gender and sex and all the rest of it. So my last question is really on behalf of parents. You've raised children, now have grandchildren, I believe. What advice would you give to parents of how to parent their children living in a world where these issues, ones around gender, are kind of dominant and present in a way that they just weren't 20 years ago, say? And we've explored in previous times of Unravelling, we've seen the sort of gender unicorn that they might encounter at school, that sort of thing. We know that a lot of the culture around this is on YouTube and social media. That's where they'll find a lot of this. And you know, as parents, how do we, you said earlier, parenting is always a hard job.
Yeah.
How would you, any advice you'd give parents, anything you'd want to say to parents really as they try and face, how do I raise my kids to be faithful to Jesus and live well in this culture?
Oh, gosh.
You know, that's a big question.
And you think I've got the answer to that?
No, just encourage us a bit, Elaine.
I think that the biggest thing you can give, well, first of all, the biggest thing a parent can give its child is to love the other parent.
Okay.
And I think that parental love for one another models something to the child that actually they will stay with him for the rest of life. And it means also that the relationship with the child is as it should be. The child is not a substitute for the other parent who isn't loved enough. So the biggest gift you can give a child, not to love the child. You must love the child, but to love the other parent first and then love the child. And I think the second gift is that the gift of time. And most children don't want the gift of time with their parents because they want to be on their iPhones and their iPads and watching Netflix and all the things that they do. But actually, that's a poor substitute for parental time. And I think if the children can be weaned off that, even for a certain time of day, so there are times when the family's in conversation, parents and children are in conversation, and you're listening to kids and getting them to share their day and saying what it was like and what the good things and bad things about their day were, and actually build that up as a kind of normality in family discourse, that the road is always open for conversation. You can drop anything. I think that's vital, and that then all the issues kind of come into that melding pot. I was with a vicar friend not long ago, and we were having a very important talk in the study, and this kid ran in with his hand, something in his hand like this, and said, "Daddy, Daddy!" And the Daddy was cross with him. "Look, I'm talking to Dr. Storkey. You were told not to run in like this." I said, "Please, let's see what he's got in his hand." And he opened his hand, and there was this beautiful newt crawling across this child's hand. He couldn't wait for his daddy to see it, and his daddy put in a discussion with me more important than seeing this child's newt. I was horrified to have been, implicated in that. Anyway, we spent quite a long time on the newt and on a discussion about newts and where he found it and all the rest of it. And the child went off very happy. And the vicar said, "I'm sorry." I said, "What are you sorry for? Are you sorry for interrupting our discussion or the way you treated your kid? Because that really wasn't what he needed." He said, "Elaine, enough." I got the point. But I think that's important. And yeah, there will be times when we won't see eye to eye with your kids, or they'll feel that they don't want. It's like Mark Twain, I was amazed how immature my father was, and by the time I was 19, I realised he'd grown up a lot. I think our children have forgiven us for whatever we did wrong in their upbringing, and they know we love us. And our grandkids are young men now, and who've got very, very different views from either us or their parents. But you listen to them too, because the shift of generations is also always a shift in worldview. The era shifts and new things come up. I did a thing in a school in Lancashire where I was talking about identity shifts, how the question of who am I moves from generation to generation to generation. And I said what it was like for my generation, what it was like for their parents' generation, and what I thought it was like for their generation. And I rattled off the thing. I am what I am my sexuality. I am what I make of myself. I am my past, and so on. And it was really interesting hearing their response. And I think, you'll make mistakes. Parents make mistakes. There's no foolproof way forward.
Yeah.
But parents are doing a wonderful job. And I really admire parents of today's culture. We didn't have it it wasn't so difficult for my generation. It really wasn't. You've got everything to play for. And you need every bit of grace from God.
I think that's probably a good place to leave our conversation. Needed the grace of God to face all these issues. But thank you so much, Elaine, for sharing out of your experience and learning and wisdom for us. And really hope for those of you that have watched this video that that's been helpful. And I hope that this video, together with the other two, holds a sort of balance really in starting to unravel issues of sex and gender in our culture. So Feel free to keep up with the rest of Unravelling. You can find it all on our website, amblecotecc.org.uk/unravelling. After this, we'll now be moving into part 4, where we'll really wrestle with issues of sex, sexuality and marriage. So we hope that you can join us for those as well.
Please visit www.amblecotecc.org.uk/unravelling.